Yes, welcome to this session, friends. In the previous sections, we have talked about war. Now, in these two next sessions, we will be talking about weapons. Now, basically, when we look at weapons, broadly speaking, there are two categories of weapons. One are the conventional weapons, the other one are the non-conventional weapons, or broadly speaking, we often call them as weapons of mass destruction. Now, to start with, first we will talk about conventional weapons. These conventional weapons include small arms, defensive shields, light weapons, sea and land mines, as well as bombs, shells, rockets, missiles, and cluster munitions. These weapons use explosive material based on chemical energy as opposed to nuclear energy in nuclear weapons. The important thing is that in situations of war, it is conventional weapons which are used or which are supposed to be used. The weapons of mass destruction are reserved for deterring threats. So primarily in international arena, nation states quite often use their nuclear weapons to create a deterrence that other states might deter from attacking a particular country because that country possesses nuclear weapons, and therefore the fear of nuclear weapons stops the other country from daring to attack this country. However, when you are talking about war, whatever the ultimate cause or objective of war, it involves basically a struggle to control territory. Military logistics make territory all the more important because it connects military forces. The supplies come from the home country, and those supply lines to the battlefield need to be open constantly. And to ensure that they are secure, the main purpose of conventional forces is to take hold or defend territory, and for that it is essential to ensure that the supply lines are open. Primarily, there are three aspects or three kinds of forces which conventional armies would have. One is the traditional army. They are the forces which are operating on the ground. They control or occupy a territory militarily. Basically, in the army, the foot soldiers are called infantry, who use light weapons. Sometimes they might also use heavy weapons, heavy artillery, for example. And in an open terrain, like for example, when the US-led forces attacked Saddam Hussein's forces in Kuwait in 1990, they used that heavy artillery there. And therefore, in an open war, when it is in an open space, the heavy artillery is quite rather useful and quite productive for big armies. And that is what we saw in that particular war. And mechanized ground forces would combine armor, artillery, and infantry. But if the war is taking place in a closed terrain, such as jungles and mountains, in that situation, foot soldiers come out to be more important. Like we saw in Afghanistan and many other wars, when big powers are fighting countries which are relatively less powerful. But because of the terrain, the advantage which that big power and country could have had in an open terrain is neutralized because the terrain is very close. And therefore, in that situation, the foot soldiers have a distinct advantage, and that we saw in the war in Afghanistan and in many other situations in the world. When armies operate, they also use land mines to defend territory. Now, these land mines are, mines which are put under the land, and they are apparently not visible, but the moment somebody steps on them, they explode. So, these landmines are very dangerous in the sense that even if the war has stopped, even decades after the war, they continue to be buried there in the land there. And civilians and ordinary people, once they are doing farming or something else and somebody treads on that, it explodes, killing some people or even, disabling them, or, they have to get one of their legs or arms amputated. So it is something, which not only affects the armies, because the effects are felt even after the war. And therefore, and that has been very extensively used, in Afghanistan, in Bosnia, and many other areas. But as a result, but as a consequence of the realization of countries that it is something, which does not, the usage of this kind of a weapon does not stop with the war, and it has consequential effects even after the war has stopped. So therefore, there was a consensus at the international level, especially among the big powers, and a treaty to ban landmines was signed in the year 1997. There are many non-governmental organizations operating in different countries of the world which have been working for banning these, landmines. Then, other than other than the army being an arm of the conventional fighting force of a country, the next is the navy. The navy controls passage through seas to attack land which is near the coastlines, and even attack any other movement in the sea lanes. And how important it is that sea lanes are open has been amply demonstrated in the recent events in the Red Sea, where the Houthis have been attacking ships which have been flowing, which have been moving through the Red Sea, and that has created a big effect on the international trade. So that is something very important, and Navy is there to defend the sea lanes. And you see how the Americans and other big powers have deployed their warships and aircraft carriers to ensure that those their own carriages and their own ships which move through the Red Sea are secure, but still the situation is very tenuous. So therefore that is something which is the task of the Navy. And then the Navy facilitates the taking of the fighting forces near the coast or the borders of country where you want to fight a war. So that facilitates movement of troops through the waters to the coastlines where your forces have to disembark and fight. Now, when a state controls sea in wartime, it has a distinct advantage because it can move its goods and forces through the sea. But if those sea lanes are under its control, it can prevent the enemy from moving its goods and forces through that sea. So that gives a distinct advantage in the time of a war. And then in navies, there are all kinds of, submarines and warships, and then there are aircraft carriers. Now, aircraft carriers are huge, which very few countries can have because it is very difficult to build, and it entails a lot of cost and technological, addition, and that is something, which only big powers can do. So what are these aircraft carriers? They are like small cities, on which even aircraft and fighter jets can land and take off from there, and there are all kinds of, weapons and equipments there, and they are so huge. And they are basically used as an instrument of power projection. So wherever there is a region in the world, where the big powers have to project their power, the aircraft carrier moves in that region. In the recent past, we have heard of American aircraft carriers moving close to the Red Sea and in areas around that, because that is the region, where a lot of conflict is happening presently, and the Americans want to exert their power, to project the power in that region. And that's the reason that aircraft carrier Eisenhower had moved in that region. And similarly, other big powers like Russia or China would use the aircraft carriers to project their power. So its mere presence, implies a threat to use force. So it's like such a huge presence in the sea, and it implies, your intention, that you have an intention to use force when need be. So it puts a lot of pressure on the adversary. Then there are missile firing ships, which are much cheaper and smaller, but they are they are relatively faster and stealthier in the waters. They are also strong instruments of power projection. And then in addition to them, there are submarines which can attack ships and also fire missiles at land targets. So from the submarines, missiles can be fired on the land targets. Then in the navies, some big countries like America and Russia have the Marines, the celebrated Marines who are expert fighters, amphibious fighters who are fighting both on the seas as well as on land. The basic thing is that they are part of the navy, but they can be deployed in a situation where they are, immediately, they embarked on a land area where they have been deployed, and then they'll do their operations, and then they would try to come back. So they are basically used in distant areas where the great power has to do some intervention at some distant area. We might have all heard about the killing of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. So that was carried out with the Marines. America took its Marines and they were rather taken through aircrafts in that area, and then they went there, did the operation and returned back to America. So Marines are a very elite, part of the American army. In addition to the Navy, finally you have the Air Force. So traditionally, since time immemorial, the other arms of the fighting conventional forces like the armies and navies have always been extremely important. In the 19th century, it was said that any great power in the world can only be great if it has a huge or great or powerful navy. So naval forces are basically the main factor in your power projection at the international level, and they ensure that you are a great power at the global level. But in the 20th century, and as we came to the end of the 20th century and to the beginning of the 21st century, we saw slowly that Air Force came to occupy the topmost position in all these fighting arms. And today, Air Force is supposed to be the most important arm of the conventional armies of any country of the world. And the stronger your Air Force, the stronger you are militarily. Now, the Air Force is something which is very much technology driven. The better your technology, the better your Air Force is. And since in today's world, America has the best technology in terms of its Air Force, so it has got the maximum, capability as far as its conventional forces are concerned. The Air Force is used to do strategic bombing of land and sea targets. It can intercept enemy aircraft. It is used to airlift supplies and even weapons from the host country to whichever area in the world you want to do that. They do reconnaissance, they fire missiles effectively, and all kinds of things are done, which we see in warfare every day. So Air Force, or the operation of Air Force, is more like a computer game, as children play on the computer games that you are sitting here and you are just pressing buttons. And then your, aircrafts are flying on the screens and they are doing things whatever you want in a computer game. It is exactly like this in the real battlefield. Countries which have the best Air Force, the most technologically advanced fighter jets and other, missiles and other equipment, they are much better off in the battlefield. And that we see in all theaters of warfare, wherever Air Force of a superior country is coming face to face with a country which has lesser number of or aircrafts or equipments which are of lesser quality or which are not of that state of art nature, and they have a distinct disadvantage. We saw in the Gulf War, how laser guided bombs, cruise missiles were used by the Americans, which are smart bombs and which know exactly where to go and where to hit. So they are all computer operated weapons, and if countries have that as compared to some other country which does not have that, there would be a distinct advantage. And the other thing is that these smart bombs, so these laser guided bombs and these equipments and fighter jets, they are extremely prohibitively expensive. So poor countries cannot even think of having them. And therefore, big countries, powerful countries, rich countries have a distinct advantage. The other important thing is that most of these equipments, military equipments, the Air Force, they are manufactured by countries in the global West, global North. And these countries would not even sell their best weapons to other countries. So even if you have the money, for example, Saudi Arabia is usually the biggest expender in buying weapons every year. But even if Saudi Arabia wants to buy all the weapons which are there in the world, the Americans would not sell them, or the Western countries would not sell them the state-of-the-art weapons. So the best weapons which they are using in their defense forces, they don't give it to anyone. Maybe they give it to their closest allies. For example, for the Americans, they might share it with Israel, but nobody else. So even if you have the money, you can buy weapons which are not of that generation which they are using. Weapons are, they are of generations, A certain technology is there in this generation, so the next generation would have a technology which is distinctly different from this technology. So they are the second generation weapons. Then there are the third generation weapons and the fourth generation weapons. So for example, if the American Air Force is using the fourth generation weapons, those weapons are not for sale. The weapons which it is no more using, those weapons would be on sale. For the simple reason that even if tomorrow, and you are apparently a friendly country of America or the Western countries, and even if tomorrow there is some kind of a military conflict between you and them, or between some other country where you seem to have given that supplied that weapon to the third party, so the Americans or those Western countries who are the suppliers would have a distinct advantage in the battlefield. So therefore, even if you have the money, you can't get the state of the art or the latest weapons which these countries and the air forces would be having. And it is so very important, in today's world, because as I mentioned, Air Force is the most important, which was very nicely demonstrated, in the 2003 Iraq war, where we saw the usefulness of air power to shock and awe the enemy, to demoralize the enemy. America used that air power, their forces used that air power to shock the adversary. And Iraq was rather pummeled with so much of air power, that their capacity was reduced to a very low level, their fighting capacity was almost, neutralized. However, there are limitations to the Air Force also. Because if you are fighting a war, like it was demonstrated in this very war, that America used its air power to the maximum, but that air power or the Air Force cannot get you control of the territory. So when you want to control that territory, you have to get on the ground. Because when you are in the air, your casualties are relatively lesser. But when you go on the ground, you have to suffer a lot of casualties because the adversary is also there to fight you, even if you have better weapons. But you are face to face with the adversary. But that is something which you cannot avoid, as America realized in that war and in many other wars, that you have to get on the ground. And when you get on the ground, the adversary is almost equal to you. So you lose a lot of your fighting forces because a lot of people get killed and injured when you are fighting on the ground. So Americans had to get on the ground despite using all kinds of air power on the Iraqis, but to control Baghdad and other territories there, they had to get on the ground. Same was the case in Afghanistan, you have to get on the ground. So when you have to control a country, eventually you have to be on the ground. Your armed forces, your foot soldiers have to come into play eventually if you want to control a territory. Although if there is a limited objective and you just want to incapacitate the adversary or to reduce the capacity or the fighting power of the adversary, you can just go and bomb them, as the Americans did in Bosnia. That there was an air operation, you did that and you came back. But if the purpose is to control the territory in a war, which usually is, the country, however powerful it is, has eventually to get on the ground. Now, today, what is happening with war and weapons, that new technologies are coming in. And as I mentioned, these new technologies are every day, coming in a way that war is now being reduced to more like a computer game, So it's not an issue of strength and your valor or your bravery as it used to be in the past. it is more about technology. So if we have better technology, we have a distinct advantage over the adversary on the battlefield. And the other important thing is that this coming in of technology has undermined the territorial basis of war and of the state itself. So it is not that war is limited to this particular territory now, and a state actor is the only actor which is fighting the war, that is something which is changing. And it is also equalizing adversaries to a great extent, who might be even lesser in numbers and even inferior in terms of firepower. So technology is empowering even small groups to take on big states or bigger adversaries, which was something unthinkable in the past. And the classic example is the terrorist attacks on the US World Trade Center in 2001. You can imagine, just imagine that a superpower like America is so very powerful, and there are just 19 people who come in different planes and shock the American empire. And around 3,000 people are killed, and there's a loss worth billions of dollars. So that kind of damage, that kind of huge damage is inflicted on the most powerful country by a group of people. Howsoever well they might have been trained, howsoever much they might have been motivated, but this is something, which shows that how the technology empowers even limited number of people to take on big states. So technology cuts both ways, It could be an advantage in some cases where the countries which are technologically advanced have better fighting units, have better equipments, have better fighter jets, better missiles and everything. But the same thing, if it goes in the hands of the adversary, it is something, which is a big disadvantage on the battlefield. So when technology is used in the battlefield, it refers to electromagnetic spectrum. It is the use of radar, infrared, imaging equipment to see in the darkness, through fog or great distance. So forces today cannot be hidden as it used to be in the past. So if you have, these equipments, you can ensure that the enemy does not get hidden. And when the enemy is on the move, you can easily know because you have these technologies. So on the one hand, you cannot hide because the enemy has all these technologies, and when the enemy is coming to you, you have countermeasures. You have technologies like stealth technology. America has got stealth bombers, which China even has got, even Russia has got, but they are prohibitively expensive. So countries which are relatively poorer and they are rather having less resources cannot afford to have these technologies. But these technologies, are changing the nature of warfare, where it's difficult to hide. So you have all kinds of technologies whereby you can expose the enemy's forces wherever they are hidden, and then if they come to you, you are able to, check their movements and then counter them, and vice versa. Then another important thing is that today there is miniaturization of weaponry. So weapons are getting smaller and smaller and even cheaper. So sometimes, for example, an infantry soldier can fire a shoulder-fired missile costing only maybe $10,000 to destroy a tank worth $1 million. So that kind of a weaponry, which is available to many countries of the world, even if, those countries don't buy those weapons, but they might travel to them through different routes, and they can, create a situation where less amount of resources and less number of weapons are used to inflict very serious damage on the adversary. So when it is being done by countries, which are actually using these kinds of weapons, they are very happy at that. But when the same treatment is meted out of them in return, they are at a distinct disadvantage. For example, in the war in Afghanistan, so the Taliban and the rebels there were given, these Stinger missiles by the Americans to fight the Soviets. So they were able to inflict very heavy damage on the Soviets because these Stinger missiles can be fired from soldier, they can be moved from one place to another very easily, and these very inexpensive missiles can be used to bring down a jet fighter, which is so very expensive, or a helicopter, gunship, which is so very expensive. So that was very good for the Americans, that they were able to inflict very serious damage on the adversary. But once the war ended and the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, and then what happened, that situation changed, and after some time America itself intervened there, but a lot of those weapons remained with the rebels, and now the same weapons were being used in American jets and American fighters and American helicopters, and they were being brought down by the Stinger missiles which were being used by the rebels or the Afghan forces there. So you are being given the you are having a taste of your own medicine eventually, what you had used there. So therefore, conventional weapons today are undergoing a lot of change. And actually, in the world of today, conventional weapons have become a very lucrative business also. So on the one hand, they give a very distinct advantage to countries which are technologically advanced, which are rich, and which make these weapons, and which have these weapons with the armies and air force and navies, and which use these weapons to their advantage. On the other hand, they are earning lots of money, with that. For example, America is the biggest exporter of weapons in the world. So around 40-45% of the weapons in the world which are traded every year are sold by the Americans, and most of the remaining weapons are being sold by some around 10% by China, and the rest by the European countries in the Western Europe. So what is the advantage? Because most of these weapons are weapons in which these countries are the monopolists in the market. So they earn lots of money by selling these weapons, because these are weapons which only, for example, America is making certain category of weapons. So if a country wants to get that weapon, because they are the most technologically advanced and you want to have the best weapons, you have to pay through your nose to get those weapons. Because they are the monopolists, so they set the price, and they are so very expensive. And once you purchase these weapons, especially the Air Force, things like the like the jet fighters and the other kinds of equipments, they create a certain kind of dependency, because these weapons, even after a single usage, they need a lot of spare parts. And Americans would not supply you the spare parts so easily. So they give you some spare parts, but they will retain the remaining supplies with them. And if they are satisfied with the way you are using these weapons, or they are politically happy with you, they would continue to supply these spare parts to you. Otherwise, they would stop the spare parts supply, and your weapons are useless with you. For example, for a long time, a lot of F-16s were sitting with the Pakistani army because the Americans had refused to supply them spare parts. And these spare parts again are very, very expensive. So once they earn a lot of money by supplying you with those aircrafts, and then they will take a lot of money from you by giving you the spare parts, because it is they only who make those spare parts. So therefore, they keep on earning lots of money from you, and then they have a leverage and control over the usage of these weapons, because the moment they stop the supply of spare parts, these weapons are useless for you. So they can retain their control over the weapons and their usage even after they have supplied you and taken a lot of money from you. So therefore, it is a great advantage to America and the other European countries, who are the main suppliers of weapons to other countries of the world, and that is the advantage which they get. So this is the basic idea about conventional weapons, what these weapons are, and how they are changing. Today in the world, we have even cyber warfare, where technology is being used, or computers are being used to incapacitate or corrupt the computers of the adversary, and all these systems in the army today are operating through the computing systems. So thereby your fighting capacity, or your capacity in terms of the operation of your forces can be rather neutralized, or can be severely damaged by the use of the cyber warfare. So all of these things combined give us a basic idea about what conventional weapons are, what are the types of conventional forces, and how these weapons are used, and how the nature of warfare is changing with the induction of more and more technology and science into weaponry or weapon systems in the world. Thank you.